Montana Territory, 1881. The wind howled across the open plains as the stagecoach rattled into the dusty town of Dry Creek, dragging with it a woman whose heart had long since stopped hoping. Keziah Mae Monroe sat stiffly, hands clenched in her lap, her bruised cheek hidden beneath her bonnet. The hem of her blue traveling dress was torn, dust caked into the fabric. Her ribs ached from where Matthew had kicked her last 2 days before she'd escaped his cabin outside Helena. She had been his mail-order bride, brought west with promises of love and steadiness. What she got was a man with angry fists and a voice soaked in whiskey. She had nowhere else to go. No family back east anymore, no money, just a single letter in her pocket from a rancher in Dry Creek, not meant for her. It had been tucked into a discarded newspaper, meant for another woman who never came. But the words in it, kind, steady, simple, had been her last hope. Now she stepped down from the coach with nothing but that letter and a split lip. The town was small, just a saloon, a general store, a sheriff's office, and a dusty church. A few men leaned against posts, watching her with narrowed eyes. She pulled her shawl tighter and kept her gaze down. "Miss Monroe." The voice was deep, steady, and warm like the sun after a storm. She looked up. He stood tall, lean, with a worn hat in his hand and a rifle slung across his back. His hair was thick and dark, jaw dusted with stubble. His eyes were the color of riverbed stone gray, unreadable but not unkind. "I am," she whispered. "I am Vance O'Hara," he said. "I wrote the letter." She stared at him, stunned. "But I thought that was meant for someone else." He nodded slowly. "It was, but you are here, and you look like you need someone to mean what they say." Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to say something worth hearing, but her voice cracked instead. Vance looked down at the torn hem of her dress and the shadowed bruise on her cheek. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "You need a place to rest." She nodded. He reached for her satchel, but she flinched. He paused, his hand still, then stepped back. "I will walk you to my horse," he said gently. He led her toward a chestnut mare tied to the post. The horse nickered softly as Keziah approached. Vance lifted the saddlebag and tied it behind the saddle, then offered her his hand. She hesitated, then placed her fingers in his. His touch was warm, firm, but not rough. He helped her up without a word, then mounted behind her without crowding her space. The ride was quiet, the plains wide and golden beneath the late summer sun. "You live alone?" she asked finally. "I do," he said. "My folks passed on 5 years ago. I run the ranch myself." She nodded, eyes on the horizon. They reached the ranch as the sun touched the edge of the sky. The house was small but clean, with white shutters and a stone chimney. A barn stood nearby, and 2 cows grazed in the distance. "You can rest here as long as you need," Vance said as he helped her down. She followed him inside. The house smelled of wood smoke and fresh bread. There was a worn armchair near the hearth, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow staircase that led to a small loft. "I will take the barn tonight," he said quietly. "You can have the bed. You do not have to, I do." He set her satchel on a stool by the fire and took a blanket from the chest. "If you need anything, call for me." She nodded, throat thick. That night Keziah lay in the bed, the scent of pine on the pillow, the ache of her ribs easing in warmth. For the first time in weeks she did not fear the sound of footsteps. She slept. The next morning she woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Vance had left a plate on the table and was already outside tending the cattle. She stayed for days. She helped with chores where she could, peeling potatoes, washing clothes, sweeping the porch. Her bruises faded, but the fear stayed close, like a shadow. One afternoon, as she scrubbed the porch steps, Vance came around the corner with a bundle of firewood. "You do not need to work," he said. She kept her eyes down. "I feel better when I do." He set the wood down. "You do not have to earn your place here, Keziah." She looked up slowly. "I do not know what to do with kindness. I keep waiting for it to turn into something else." He crouched before her, elbows on his knees. "It will not from me." Her fingers tightened around the brush. "Why?" "Because I do not hurt people to feel strong. I do not take what is not given." She blinked, and something deep inside her cracked open. She looked away fast, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Do not be." That night she watched him from the kitchen window. He was brushing down the mare, humming low under his breath. The barn lantern lit his profile firm, quiet, steady. She did not know when her heart began to shift. Maybe it was the way he never asked, never touched without invitation. Or maybe it was the way he looked at her like she was whole, even when she felt anything but. Days turned into weeks. Keziah began to smile again, just a little. She began to laugh, soft and unsure. She began to trust. One morning she found a small carved horse left on her quilt. The grain of the wood was smooth, the shape careful. She carried it to him in the barn. "You made this," he nodded. "It is beautiful," he shrugged. "I thought you might like it." She held it close, then looked up at him. "I do." The silence stretched. "I was not supposed to come here," she said. "I lied just to survive. You came. That is what matters." Tears welled up again, but she held them back. "You are the only person who has ever made me feel safe." He stepped closer, slow and careful. "Then let me keep doing it." She looked up into his eyes. "Why?" "Because I want to, because I care about you." Her lips parted. "You do?" "I do." She reached out, fingers trembling, and touched his hand. He closed his around hers. Neither of them said another word, but something had begun. Something real. And neither of them would ever be the same again. Keziah stood ankle-deep in the creek behind the barn, morning light catching on the water as she rinsed a basket of carrots. The cold bit at her skin, but she welcomed the sting. It reminded her she was still here, still choosing each day to stay. Her sleeves were rolled, her hands chapped, her heart quieter than it had been in years. From the hill, Vance approached with a slow, even gait. He carried a small wooden box, the corners nailed clean, the lid carved with a pine branch. He didn't speak until she looked up. "I made you something again," he said, "for your sewing things." She wiped her hands on her apron and took the box. The lid opened smooth on a brass hinge. Inside, felt-lined compartments waited for needles, thread, buttons. She traced the carved edge with her thumb, then met his eyes. "I never asked you to do all this. You didn't need to." The air settled between them, soft with the hush of water and wind in the cottonwoods. She closed the lid gently. "I used to sew clothes for my younger brother. He'd rip every shirt before a month passed. Said buttons were a bother, always in the way." "You miss him." "I do," she said, voice low. "He died in a fire." "I was 16. Vance nodded once, respectful silence filling the space where words had no use. She set the box beside the basket and looked out toward the pasture. "You don't speak much about yourself." He folded his arms. "Not from keeping things. Just don't see use in filling air with talk unless it means something." "Then tell me something that does." He shifted his weight, thoughtful. "I was supposed to marry once. Name was Leela. She caught fever before we wed, buried her 2 days before spring thaw." Keziah's breath caught. "I'm sorry." "I know," he said gently. "But I say it so you know when I care for someone, I don't do it halfway." She looked at him then, long and searching, like a woman trying to see what might still be possible after too many years of barely surviving. That afternoon, she wandered the property while Vance rode out to mend the north fence. She found the root cellar behind the house, half covered in moss. Inside, shelves were lined with preserved peaches, pickled beans, and jars labeled in tidy script. She wasn't sure what made her do it, but she spent the next hour boiling water, scrubbing jars, slicing cucumbers from the garden. Her hands moved with memory, and by sundown, 4 fresh jars sat cooling on the counter. When Vance returned, dust on his boots and sun in his hair, he paused at the door, taking in the smell of vinegar and dill. "You did all this." "I wanted to contribute," she said. His gaze didn't linger on the jars. It lingered on her. "Thank you," he said softly. "It means something." That evening they sat beneath the porch overhang, watching clouds shift along the edge of the mountains. The breeze carried the scent of cut grass and distant rain. "I don't know how to be someone's anything anymore," she said, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I can clean, I can cook, but I don't know what it looks like to be loved and not punished for it." Vance leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "It looks like being seen, heard. It looks like no bruises, no raised voices. Just quiet, steady days where you're never made to shrink to fit someone else's anger." Her throat tightened. She looked down at her hands, worn and pale in the twilight. "I've never had that." "You could," he said, "if you wanted it." She didn't answer right away. Then slowly she reached out, resting her fingers lightly over his where they lay on his knee. She didn't hold on, just touched. He didn't move. "I want to learn," she said, "but I'll be slow." "I'll match your pace," he said. The lantern behind them flickered through the window, casting warm light across the porch boards. The night settled around them, not heavy but full, as if the earth itself was pausing to listen. For the first time her hand stayed where it was, and his turned gently, so their palms met. By mid-September, the cottonwoods along the creek turned gold, their leaves trembling in the wind like coins strung on invisible thread. Keziah stood at the edge of the pasture fence, watching a hawk spiral above the hills. Vance was hammering planks nearby, reinforcing the chicken coop before the first snows. The air held the scent of pine sap and distant smoke from someone's brush pile. "You always stay through the winter?" she asked, brushing her palms on her skirt as she turned to him. He set the hammer down and leaned against the fence rail. "Every year. Gets bitter cold come late November, but the stove holds. I keep the stock close. Dig out paths to the barn when the snow stacks high." Her eyes followed the rise of the hills beyond the property, where the tree line thickened. "I've never stayed in one place long enough to see a season fully change." "You're welcome to stay through it," he said, his voice quiet but certain, "if you want it." "I wouldn't know how to plan for a winter. I've always left before the cold set in, or someone made me." He didn't interrupt. He just waited. She looked down at her hands. "I don't have a coat thick enough for snow." "I can spare one of mine," he said. "It won't be pretty, but it's warm, and I'll show you how to line your boots with wool." She gave a small nod, something like gratitude flickering behind her eyes. "I want to try." He pushed off the fence and crossed to her, stopping close enough she could feel the warmth of his presence, but not so close that it trapped her. "You won't have to do it alone." That night, the kettle bubbled on the stove and Keziah stirred in silence, the soft scrape of the spoon grounding her. Vance sat at the table, oiling the hinges of a bridle. The room was quiet in a way that didn't press. "I found something today," she said, not turning. He looked up. "In the bottom of my satchel, a ribbon. One I wore when I first arrived in Helena." She placed it on the counter beside the flour tin. "I don't know why I kept it. It doesn't mean anything anymore." He set the bridle aside and stood. "Maybe it does." "Why?" "Because you brought it here, through everything. Maybe it reminds you that you were someone before all of it, that you still are." She turned then, her face unreadable in the firelight. "How do you carry things without letting them weigh you down?" "I don't." He reached for the bridle again. "I just make sure I'm carrying them for the right reason." Later, after the dishes were dried and put away, she sat beside the hearth, sewing a torn glove. Vance dropped a few logs onto the fire and dusted his hands. "You ever read?" he asked. "Used to, when I had books." He nodded toward a shelf above the mantel. "There's a few left from my mother, sermons mostly, but there's a journal too from when she came west." Keziah looked up. "She wrote it herself, every day. I reckon she thought it might be read by someone who needed it one day." She rose without hesitation and took the worn book down. The leather binding was cracked, the ink faded in places. She opened to a page at random and read aloud. "I miss the sound of rain on the roof back in Ohio, but there's something here that steadies me. The wind is louder, but the quiet runs truer." Vance rested his hand on the back of the chair. She had a way of finding hope in hard places. Keziah turned another page, her fingers grazing the careful script. "I'd like to learn that. You already are." The following morning she surprised him. "I want to help with the calves," she said, tugging on a pair of his spare boots. "You've been doing it alone, and I want to learn." He didn't argue, just handed her a pair of gloves and led her to the pen. The calf bucked once when she tried to guide it in with a rope looped gentle around its neck. She stumbled, caught herself, and laughed, not a loud laugh, but one clear and real. Vance watched with quiet approval as she steadied her stance, braced her feet, and kept going. By dusk, her braid was loose, her hands sore, and her cheeks flushed with cold. She leaned against the barn wall, breathing hard, a ribbon of straw caught behind her ear. "You're good at this," he said, tying the last gate latch. "I'm not afraid of work," she said. "Just never had the space to do it without fear." "You have it now." She met his gaze, steady and unguarded. "I believe you." He brushed a bit of hay from her shoulder. "I'm glad you're here." She didn't look away. "So am I." And in that stillness, nothing needed to be said. The wind shifted through the trees, and the ranch held the shape of something whole, something beginning. The first snow came in thin, uncertain flurries, blowing sideways across the fields before melting into the earth. Keziah stood at the window with a hand to the glass, watching the sky change. It was the kind of morning that asked for quiet, no words, no movement, just the hush of a world preparing to go still. Behind her, Vance finished latching the door against the draft. His coat was damp at the shoulders, and his gloves left wet prints on the table as he set them down. "I checked the stock. They're keeping close to the barn," he said, brushing his hands together. "We'll need to bring in more wood if it holds through tomorrow." Keziah turned. "I can carry it." "My shoulders aren't as soft as they look." He gave a low chuckle, rubbing a spot on his neck where the cold had reddened the skin. "I never doubted that." They bundled up and stepped out into the gray light. The wind had quieted, but the air held a bite. Keziah walked ahead toward the stacked cords near the shed, her boots crunching through the scattered frost. She paused beside the woodpile, eyes narrowing at a set of small prints leading toward the tree line. Rabbit, maybe, or fox. She knelt and touched the track, her fingers brushing the cold earth. "You read prints?" Vance asked, coming beside her with an armful of logs. "I used to follow signs with my brother. He liked to pretend we were scouts. I was better at it than him, though he'd never admit it." She rose and took a few pieces from his arms. "We tracked a deer once for miles, just to see if we could. Never caught it. But he carved the trail into a piece of bark and said it was proof we were better than any trapper west of the Alleghenies." Vance studied her face. "You ever think about doing that again, tracking, I mean?" She balanced the wood against her hip. "Maybe. I don't know who I'd be doing it for." "You don't need a reason to do something that makes you feel alive." She hesitated, then nodded. "I'll think on that." Inside, the warmth met them in waves. She stacked the wood beside the hearth while he stirred the coals back to life, sending a plume of sparks up the chimney. The kettle whistled low behind them. As the fire took, she sank into the chair nearest the heat. Her fingers flexed from the cold, and she rubbed them together absently. "I've been thinking," she said, voice soft, "about what comes after winter." He looked over from the hearth. "You thinking of leaving when the snow melts?" "I was," she admitted, "but I don't feel the same as I did. I've been waiting to feel like myself again, but I think maybe I'm not supposed to go back to who I was." He sat across from her, elbows on his thighs. "You're not the same. That doesn't mean you're lost." She looked at the fire, its light painting her face in flickering gold. "I've been trying to build something in my mind that isn't just survival, a place I choose, a life that doesn't feel like I borrowed it." Vance didn't speak right away. Then, quietly, "You'd be choosing this." Her voice didn't falter. "Yes." He leaned forward, his voice low. "Then I'd give you this place. Not as shelter, not as payment, as a home ours if you wanted it." Her eyes lifted to his, and whatever fear had shaped her once was no longer the loudest thing inside her. "I do." The silence stretched between them, soft and full. "I ain't never asked a woman for anything permanent," he said. "Not like this, but I want to wake up beside you come spring and every season after." She reached across the table, her hand wrapping around his. "I want the same." The snow thickened outside, falling in slow, heavy flakes. Inside, the fire burned steady, and for the first time in years, Keziah felt the shape of her life take root, not in fear, not in flight, but in the quiet, daily choosing of love. By late October, the ground held frost until mid-morning, and the creek had begun to slow beneath a skin of ice. Keziah stood in the barn loft, sorting old burlap sacks, her breath visible in the still air. Below, Vance was tightening the harness on a plow horse they'd be using to clear brush near the west fence. Neither of them spoke much while they worked, but the quiet between them was full of understanding. She found a tin box tucked behind a beam, likely forgotten for years. Inside were photographs, small, faded portraits mounted on stiff cards. A woman with a calm mouth and strong jaw, a boy with a crooked part in his hair, a man in a Union uniform. When she came down, she held the box out. "Your family." Vance took it, brushing dust from the lid. "Yeah, that's my mother. The boy's my younger brother. He drowned in the Gallatin when I was 19. He didn't explain how or why, and she didn't ask. She stood beside him, eyes on the photograph of the woman. "She looks like someone who kept things going when they shouldn't have." "She did," he said. "She taught me how to patch a saddle and how to cook a stew without meat. She could stitch a wound with less fuss than most doctors." Keziah touched the edge of the card gently. "She sounds like someone I would have trusted." "I think she would have liked you," he said. They spent the afternoon clearing the brush, working side by side. A flock of crows watched from the fence posts, silent except for the occasional flutter of wings. Vance handed her a hatchet when they reached a knot of dead saplings, and she swung with precision, the blade biting clean. "You take to things fast," he said, pulling the thorns from his gloves. "I had to," she said. "Most of my life I had to learn before someone lost patience. You're safe now. You can take your time." She didn't answer, but her shoulders eased slightly. That night they ate by lantern light roasted squash, cornbread, and apples stewed with cloves. Afterward, Keziah opened the journal Vance's mother had kept and read aloud while he polished the blade of his knife. "The snow came early this year. I watched it settle on the eaves and thought of home, but I didn't feel the same ache I used to. There's a kind of peace in making a new life where no one thought one could grow." Keziah closed the book. "She sounds like someone who believed in second chances." "She had to," Vance said. "She left everything behind in Kentucky. Came here with only what she could carry and a child at her hip." Keziah ran her hand over the worn leather cover. "You think she ever stopped looking back?" "I think she looked back less often." The first real snow came 2 days later. Heavy, wet flakes that piled fast. They kept to the house, bringing in extra wood and boiling water for washing. Vance showed her how to twist the stove damper to keep the heat low through the night. She mended shirts while he carved drawer handles for the kitchen. One evening, she looked up from her stitching. "I want to marry you." The words came plain, unadorned. Vance stopped sanding the edge of the drawer pull. "You sure?" She nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything, not because I need safety, not because I'm afraid, because I want to stay. Because I love you." He set the wood down and crossed to her. "Then I'll ask you proper." She rose to meet him. He took her hands. "Keziah Mae Monroe, will you be my wife? Not for shelter or company, but because we've built something worth keeping." She smiled, eyes steady. "Yes." They married in the church at the edge of Dry Creek on a morning so clear it made the snow shine like glass. The preacher was a quiet man with a deep voice, and the only witnesses were the storekeeper's wife and a boy who swept the steps. Keziah wore a dress she'd dyed with walnut hulls, and Vance gave her a ring he'd made from a silver coin, filed smooth and polished by hand. Afterward, they rode home together, the horse's breath steaming in the cold. Keziah leaned into his side as the land stretched out before them, white and still. That winter, they settled into a rhythm. She started a small ledger to track supplies and began keeping her own journal beside the one his mother had left behind. Vance repaired the barn roof in stages, and in the evenings, he read aloud from a tattered book of folk tales while she quilted by firelight. They planted their first garden the next spring: onions, cabbage, squash, and a row of wildflowers along the southern fence. Vance built her a drying rack for herbs, and Keziah taught him to tell the difference between plantain and false dandelion. In midsummer, she rested a hand low over her belly and told him, quiet and steady, "There's a child coming." He held her then, arms wrapped strong around her back, and whispered, "You've given me everything." They named the baby Ruth, after the woman who'd written in quiet script about new beginnings. She had Keziah's eyes and Vance's calm mouth. Years passed, and the ranch grew with them. A second child arrived, a boy they named Lee. The house was expanded 2 more rooms, a new porch that faced the creek. Keziah never wore the ribbon again, but she kept it inside her sewing box, folded beside the carved horse Vance had given her that first autumn. A reminder not of pain, but of the long road to peace. They grew older together, weathered and steady, each season marking the land and their lives in quiet, certain ways. And they were happy, deeply, truly, in the way only 2 people who had once been broken could understand.